good evening, wherever you are. I know I'm Central Time Zone, so it's 6 o'clock for me. So right in that evening time, but I'm super glad to be with you all this evening. So welcome to Preventing and Responding to Sexual Assault. This is a wraparound community training. And just to kind of elaborate on what a wraparound training is we are working on training our wraparound community for people that are in the daily lives of people with disabilities. And so my name is Autumn Johnson. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a project coordinator and educator in the Disability Services Program at the Safe Alliance in Austin, Texas. In this role, I am partnering with other program staff to develop and pilot a new sexual assault response and prevention curriculum for youth and adults with disabilities and the people in their lives. And so just a little bit about me. Prior to coming to SAFE last year, my background includes conducting some pretty extensive research in Oklahoma on services provided to people with IDD, with the goal of understanding what services were guaranteed versus what services were actually provided, and how individuals and their staff or family felt about the quality of those services. And so the results of that research were direct policy changes to the disability services of people with IDD in Oklahoma. And I have also served as a life skills coach for adults with disabilities, working on community inclusion, equal employment, and self-advocacy and bidirectional inclusion in the community. So it's just a little bit about me and my background. But as I said, this is a wraparound community training. So we're just going to go ahead and hop on in. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask. I am open to all questions. And if I, for some reason, can't answer them, I will definitely take a note, refer back to my colleagues who are also brilliant people. And then if I can get that answer back to you, I definitely will, because I want to make sure that we can have a conversation. So I know before this, you might have had a chance to fill out this link in the chat, but there is a link here. Let's see if I can copy it and put it in the chat. I may not be able to, but let me see if I can. It's just a link to 4 questions prior to us getting started. It's just to kind of get our minds thinking about some of these topics of like what we're going to be talking about. So let me see if I can find that link for us. Sorry, y'all. Sometimes it's multiple screens going, so we've got to find everything that's going on here. Okay, here we go. Let me go ahead and put this in the chat for us. If you have a moment, I'm going to kind of give us just a little bit of background here, and then if you'll fill this out for me, that'd be great. And see if I can get back to Zoom here. So many buttons all at once. All right, there we go. That should be in the chat to everyone. If you have a chance to fill it out, that would be lovely. But all right, let's get back to here. There we go. Awesome. So just for a quick kind of like icebreaker, I was just wondering what brought you here today? Like, what about this conversation were you excited to kind of talk about or really interested in talking about? Feel free to share that in the chat, or feel free to unmute and share. I know we're kind of a smaller group today. But yeah, just curious as to why everyone's here today.
I know for me, what drew me to this topic was just the fact that my daughter's nonverbal. So, you know, I know that she's not going to be able to tell me if somebody is hurting her. So I really want to be on top of knowing what to look for in the event, God forbid, something like that were to be happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, feel free to keep thinking about that and just kind of mulling over that question kind of as we go through this presentation today. And if we don't answer any specific questions that you might have had, definitely feel like writing them down and getting those to me, because I would love to see if we can get that question answered for you. So just a little bit about SAFE. I'm going to give you some information about what we do at SAFE. So SAFE is a crisis center in Austin, Texas, like I said, that responds to domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault, exploitation, and trafficking. So SAFE stands for Stop Abuse for Everyone, and that's exactly what our mission is. And the vision is a just and safe community free from violence. So you'll see on the slide that we have a 24-hour SAFE line for support and access to services. And there's 3 different ways that you can access that SAFE line. So you can either call the line, you can text the line, or you can chat from the internet to that SAFE line. So The most important thing that I want y'all to know is that if you call SAFE, there is somebody who is friendly that will answer and listen to you. And you can always call or text or chat with SAFE staff at any time. And that could be at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, or it could be Thanksgiving Day. We're always here to support you. And I know that that's really Texas specific, but it is important that we try to get services for everyone. And if we can't, we will definitely try to point people in the right direction for sure. And we'll go over some kind of like worldwide or stateswide resources for you all as well towards the end. Another thing I just want to mention really quickly about SAFE is that all of our services are free and there's no cost to access the services at SAFE, no matter your background, status, or identity. We're here to support everyone of all ages, genders, sexual orientations, races, ethnicities, abilities, religions, and socioeconomic status and immigration statuses. So we just really want people to know that you're not alone. And I will share all this information again at the end of the presentation as well, as long as email information for me in case you do have any more questions, maybe after the session. So a little bit about Disability Services Program as well. Specifically, we do a few different things. So we provide trainings for people with disabilities on many topics, which can include safety, healthy relationships, and safer sexuality. We also train, present to, and provide technical assistance to other disability organizations, victim service professionals, criminal justice staff, family members, and other stakeholders in the community. So that could be teachers or school personnel, direct service providers, advocacy groups, etc. So we're constantly working with other community partners to try to recognize and address the gaps in services for people with disabilities, because as we know, there are many to confront and challenge. So Disability Services is going on 26 years as a program at SAFE, and we're really excited. I'm really excited to be here with you today to continue pursuing that mission of stopping abuse for everyone, and that includes people with disabilities. So, all right, got a couple different objectives, and I know we've got quite a bit of time, so we're kind of here for 2 hours, and that can be a lot of me talking. So I love it when I can talk with you all, or if you all want to kind of join in, and we'll do a couple of things that are participation based, so that hopefully you're not just listening to me kind of like talk the whole time. But a couple of our learning objectives today, we're going to talk about violence in the lives of individuals with disabilities, talk about some misconceptions that are around dating and sex and disability, and compare those to some facts that we know based on research. And then we're going to go talk through ways that we can identify indicators of sexual assault and abuse and trauma-informed responses, but also ways to kind of reduce that risk of sexual assault through skill building and protective factors. So quite a few things on the list today, but I first want to just acknowledge that it can be a really tough conversation. Talking about violence and assault can be really difficult, and talking about sex can be really awkward. So we know that there are barriers to sexual assault response and prevention education to people with disabilities and their wraparound community, which includes all of those stakeholders that we were kind of talking about, like parents, families, and friends. So we just want to acknowledge how important self-care is during our presentation today. So during this session, if you want to take care of, if you need to take a break, feel free to do so. We want you to take care of yourself. I also want to acknowledge just quickly that some of these conversations may make you think of something that happened to you or someone that you know. And so definitely feel free to take a break if you need, get up and walk around, or turn off your camera, grab a drink of water, anything that you might need, and then rejoin us whenever you can. So like we mentioned, hard topic, but we're going to dive into it. So take care of yourself as we go about these topics. So we're going to kind of jump in, and this first section, we're going to talk about violence and disability and what those statistics are, what we see, and kind of why we're here. So it's imperative that we understand the ways to prevent violence. And if it can't be prevented, we want to understand how to intervene in an effective way that supports healing, because this is happening in our community. And we're going to kind of look at those statistics of what's going on. So the big why, like, why are we here, right? What do we know? And so we know from a large national study with over 7,000 responses, more than 70% of people with disabilities said that they had experienced abuse. And from those who had experienced violence, most had experienced abuse on more than 20 occasions. So from this information, we know that people with disabilities are experiencing violence and abuse on a much larger scale than everyone else. However, if you see that third bullet point there, half of these incidences were reported to authorities, and from those reported, only 10% of abusers were arrested. And there's a lot that kind of falls into why these statistics are happening. And we're going to talk about that in a couple slides. But another fact that we know is that most perpetrators are people who are known to the victim and survivor, which tells us that most of those experiencing abuse are most likely still in contact, rely on, or in a relationship with their abuser. So as we go through these facts, I'm going to throw a couple of different facts, and we're going to talk about why there's an increased risk to trauma. But this graph that you're seeing on the screen is pulled from an NPR case called Abused and Betrayed. And so what we see looking at this graph is the risk for experiencing sexual assault for people with disabilities is significantly higher than it is for people without disabilities. And in general, people with disabilities are at a 7 times higher risk for experiencing sexual assault. And when we break that down even further and we look at people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that risk goes up even higher. And we can see that women with IDD have a 12 times higher risk of experiencing sexual assault. And this is an astronomical problem. And these numbers do not include institutional settings. So we also know that the risk in institutional settings is even higher. So we're really talking about a terrible epidemic that's happening. So since we know that for everyone, the risk of experiencing abuse from someone that you know and trust is much higher than experiencing abuse from a stranger, the idea of stranger danger is not something that we really want to rely heavily on for the main theme of how we keep safe. While it's important to know how to be safe when we're around strangers, by and large, what we see is that most perpetrators are someone that the victims know and trust. And so this is even more true for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We see that through research, 97 to 99% of abusers are known and trusted by the victim who has an intellectual disability. So in 32% of cases, which I'm throwing a lot of numbers out at y'all, but I promise we have a point in all this stuff. In 32% of those cases, abusers consisted of family members or acquaintances, and 44% had a relationship with the victim specifically related to that person's disability, whether that's maybe being a teacher, residential care staff, direct support staff, counselors, therapists, medical professionals. There's a lot of related relationships there. As the number of paid staff in a person's life goes up, so does that risk for abuse. There are some specific reasons why we see that phenomenon, but one reason is that being paid staff, having a paid staff relationship with someone is not the same as a meaningful relationship in the community. And so if someone is paid to be with you and care for you, it's not the same as someone who cares for you and who is looking out for your well-being. Unfortunately, it doesn't always mean that. And so we also know that if someone has a lot of paid staff to be with them, the more likely to be with those people in isolated environments is. And so that's where that risk of abuse goes up as well. But it is important to note that abuse can occur anywhere in the community, but it is much greater in those closed settings and in those closed institutional settings. And like we mentioned before, there's not a lot of data on those, but closed institutional settings can include supported living, state supported living centers, state hospitals, larger group home facilities, nursing homes, and small group homes. And so even in the settings that are not completely isolated from the community, like group homes, we still see that increased risk for abuse because of having kind of a lot of those relationships based on a disability versus close, meaningful community relationships. So unfortunately, this means that a lot of that delivery system that was created to meet specialized care needs of those with intellectual disabilities contributes to that risk of sexual violence. And so what we see and kind of what all these stats are telling us is that we're dealing with, you know, a very high risk for experiencing sexual assault. And so we kind of want to talk about why are these, you know, why are there reasons, like why do we see such an increased risk for experiencing abuse? And we're going to kind of go through a couple of different points here. And I know this is a lot of information, but this is, we're going to kind of get this through, and then we're going to kind of move into an activity to kind of talk through some more of our points. But I want to talk about some of these factors that we want to work to address. And the first one is being isolated and experiencing loneliness. So this creates risk for anyone. And if you're isolated from your community and you're feeling alone, you are more likely to allow those people into your life who maybe have red flags. Maybe there are people that you know aren't the safest, but you're at least creating that human connection And so it puts you at more of a risk for being around people who are not safe. And we know that unfortunately, and way too often, people with disabilities are segregated, whether that is in the classroom or being isolated in an institution, which could be the examples we mentioned on the last slide. And so the second reason why there's this big increased risk for trauma are communication barriers. So perpetrators are really skilled at looking at victims who don't have a lot of power. There's a lot of power and control, and a lot of studies done on power and control. And so if there's a communication barrier, and particularly if a person doesn't have a lot of support in communicating, or maybe they don't have a communication device, or if they use picture symbols and they don't have access to those all the time, then that person is more at risk for experiencing abuse. And so we also know that not all communication devices have language for people, that for people that people need to talk about their body parts, right? To talk about what is going on with them in their body. And so if you don't have those words to talk about your body parts, it's really difficult to disclose sexual abuse. Another point that we want to talk through is kind of this idea of learned compliance. So this is the idea that from a really young age, people with disabilities are taught to comply. They're taught to go along, taught to be happy all the time. They often don't feel like they can even express anger or anything other than being happy. And this is really problematic because when you teach compliance with anyone who they view as an authority figure, you're taking away their ability to advocate for themselves and to refuse things that they don't want to do. And so you're also talking, oh, sorry, y'all. You're also taking away their ability to report someone who might be an authority figure, right? With this idea of learned compliance. And we want to end that learned compliance and replace it with self-advocacy and self-determination skills, which we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. Okay, couple more. Another reason for increased risk is this lack of privacy and physical boundaries. And so this is really important when we think about people who need a lot of support around physical tasks. And so when care is not provided based on consent, and someone is routinely accessing your body and your space without asking, what do we think happens to boundaries, right? They tend to go away. And this is for all people, and kids experience this a lot, and they learn that this is just something that happens. And if I speak up, it doesn't matter, so I won't speak up, and that becomes normalized. And that's what learned compliance is. And it really puts someone at risk for experiencing abuse. So even when the support being provided is not explicitly physical support, we still want to make sure that we're getting consent before we go to help someone in any capacity. And we want to make sure that we're providing care supports based on consent. And so that can look like, especially if we do need to maybe access someone's body because we need to take care of hygiene or things that are necessary. It's really important to have that open conversation of, I hear your no, and I hear that you are not wanting to do this right now, or I hear that this is really frustrating, but giving the reason as to why we're accessing that person's body is really important. And that's what we talk about with consent. We can definitely dive into that a little bit later when we talk through kind of what consent is and what that looks like. Okay, next one. So the next point that we want to talk about is lack of sexuality education. So all of us really need to continue to learn about how to be good partners, how to safely express our sexuality and our desires, things that we want, things that we need. And so if you haven't been given or taught these skills, then you're going to express your sexuality in ways that are probably most likely unsafe. And so we often see when a child with disabilities is really young, physical affection is like really encouraged. Give me a hug, give me a kiss. This might have changed in the pandemic. But what we've seen in the past is that that's really encouraged. And unfortunately, we also see that people with disabilities are still encouraged to do that well past the age where any of their peers are expected to hug someone or being told to hug someone without asking, or connect through that physical affection with people that they don't know very well. And so this sets up people to be at a higher risk for abuse, because then once you hit kind of that age or maybe puberty where people want to kind of give it a hard stop of like, no, we don't want to like touch people, and we don't want to like give affection to strangers, then it telling them to never do that again. But we also haven't set them up with the skills to be able to learn other ways to connect with folks. And this falls on us as the adults in their lives to set those age appropriate boundaries around physical touch. And that goes hand in hand with sex education and learning about kind of like our bodies, our desires, our feelings, and what goes on there. So, okay, I've got 2 more, and then we'll kind of take a breather and see if there's any questions. The next one we want to talk about is the threat of loss of, we're going to talk about harmful social media messages. Got ahead of myself. A lot of the representation that we see for people with disabilities is not positive, or it's misrepresented on social media, social messages. Too often, we don't see healthy romantic relationships that include people with disabilities. And if you feel like you've never seen yourself represented in love stories, it can definitely increase your experience of isolation and grief, which was our first point. And that is going to also increase that risk of trauma. So this creates that mindset of, well, I don't know if I'm going to have that, or can I ever have that? So when someone comes along then later on in life and says, well, I'll be your girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, etc., your immediate reaction is going to be like, yes, I want this connection, this relationship, the things I never thought that I could have. And so, which, as we mentioned in previous points, that also increases that risk for abuse. And last one here is that threat of loss of independence. So most people without disabilities can move between staff settings and community settings really easily. So for example, like if you get an injury and you go to the hospital, you get treated and you leave that setting. But unfortunately for people with disabilities, that process is much harder because of the barriers and restrictions around funding. And once someone moves into a staff setting, it can almost be impossible to move out of that staff setting and back into the community. And so this can be something that perpetrators use to keep someone from reporting abuse as well. So it's another reason why there is this big increased risk for trauma, is kind of the way that, our society has set up these barriers for people to get in and out of these staff settings. Okay, I see a question in the chat. How can you set physical boundaries during physical therapy? Oftentimes therapists will gentle force and oftentimes his therapist will gentle force him into doing the task. Yeah, that's a great question. And so we're talking about boundaries and we're talking about consent. And I think it's about creating this culture of consent, which we're going to talk about here in just a little bit as well. But making sure that, when we're going to like places like physical therapy or any place where there's like medical professionals or health professionals, understanding that explaining the reason why we're kind of accessing that person's body, or accessing, what's the reason as to why we might be doing something when maybe there is a no, or maybe there is, whether that's a verbal no or like a body language no. There's a lot of different ways that we can say no. And so working with those professionals and also making sure that everything that we're doing is based on consent is really important. And especially also having those conversations and just kind of trying to set that same precedence of like, are our professionals doing the same thing that we're wanting to set an example of at home, and making sure that because you all know your children best, right? You all know the people in your life best, and they know themselves. And it's about knowing what those no's are and what they might look like, and being able to convey that with the professionals that are also working in their life, because that's a big part of it. Does that kind of answer that question? It may not, and if it doesn't, I'm going to write that down and make sure that I kind of come back to that as well. Okay, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat really quickly. In a way, yeah. Okay, let me write that one down, and I'm gonna definitely let me write that down just for a second. Okay, we'll keep moving, but I'm gonna keep that in my mind and see if there is a way that we answer that throughout this process. Okay. So we've talked through kind of the big reason of like why we're here and why there's this increased risk for trauma and an increased risk for sexual assault in our community. And so now we're going to do an activity, and it's a participation based. And so feel free to kind of hold up. I'm going to read a statement, and we're going to talk through dating and sex and disability and kind of see what we believe is like true or false. So feel free to like hold up a 1 for true or hold up 2 fingers for false, or you can type it in the chat and say 1 or 2. But we're going to kind of go through and see what we think about some of these misconceptions. Okay, so this first one says, if people do not talk about love and sex, then they are not sexual. Do we think that's 1 true or 2 false? Yeah. I see some 2s in the chats. I see some 2s on the screens. Right. Absolutely. Okay. Let's see if I can get my screen to switch. That is false. So we know that people with disabilities express their sexuality in diverse ways, just like people without disabilities. So how many of you have ever told your parents that you were having like sexual feelings? Yeah. For me, wasn't a thing. That was not something that I wanted to tell my parents about. And so just because we aren't speaking about it, or maybe they aren't speaking about it with parents, doesn't mean it isn't happening, right? So research shows that asexuality is not more common for people with disabilities, with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. However, it may be more noticeable sometimes, but this myth often stems from treating adults with disabilities like children. And only a small percentage of people with or without disabilities identify as asexual. So all children and teens and young adults with or without disabilities need that information about their bodies and about sex. It's really helpful. Okay. So on to this next one. It says, learning about sex and dating makes people have sex. Is that 1 true or 2 false? See some 2s in the chat. Yeah, see some 2s being held up. Okay, and I can't see everyone's screen, but I'm seeing a lot of 2s from where I'm at. Okay, yeah, this statement is false too. We know that too often people do not put their students or children in sex education because they believe this misconception about, if they're going to learn about sex and dating, then they're going to have sex. And that's not true, because what research has shown is that comprehensive sex education has been shown to increase safer behavior related to sexuality by causing youth and young adults to delay sexual activity. It reduces the frequency of sexual intercourse, and it also reduces the number of sex partners and increases condom use. And so that's a lot of what our research is telling us. Just because we're learning about sex and dating doesn't make people have sex or even want to date sometimes. So that one is false. There it is. Okay, next statement says, if parents and teachers don't think someone is ready to date or have sex, then they don't need sex ed. 1 true or 2 false? I see some 2s. Got a couple of 2s in the chat too. Okay. Yeah, so this one is also false. Y'all got it right. The statement is false. And a lot of the time people may think that their child or family member or young adult is nowhere near ready for this type of information. But we know that all people deserve and should have that right to information about their bodies and to sexuality and sexual desires. And so we're the experts on our own wants and needs, and information should be provided based on an individual's biological age so that it parallels their development, and not based on their support needs or based on their disability. But of course, how that information is presented should be adjusted or adapted to functional needs. And so accommodations should be made so that the individual can access that information, but information shouldn't be based on where maybe that teacher or parent thinks that person is. It's really important for us to have those conversations about where we are developmentally, what our bodies are thinking and feeling, and talking through kind of what that looks like and how to do that safely. And so those are really important conversations. All right. Next statement says, boys and girls should be separated when they learn about sex and bodies and sex. 1 for true or 2 for false? Yeah, I see some 2s. I see some more 2s. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Y'all are right. This is false. So research on sex education shows that it's not best practice for many reasons. The first reason is being that it's an unsafe choice to present to students, children, and young adults who are non-binary and transgender. But the second reason is that it reinforces this idea that sex shouldn't be discussed in mixed company. And so we don't want to reinforce that this is like shameful or wrong or just not a topic that we talk about. We want folks to be prepared to have conversations about their sexual limits, to talk about STIs, condom use, protections with any gender, because we also aren't wanting to assume who their sexual partner is going to be. So we want them to feel comfortable having these conversations with people of different genders. And it also gives the idea that students are receiving different messages if we split them into two groups, right? Boys and girls. And so an interesting fact, just from research, kind of as we're talking about, why all these things are the way they are, is that when students were asked what makes them most comfortable when receiving sex education, it wasn't really about being with only people of the same gender. It was about how comfortable that facilitator was with the material. And so if that facilitator is very stiff and uncomfortable, so will that conversation be. And so if the facilitator can recognize the awkwardness and talk through it and kind of help people feel comfortable in these conversations, students are much more engaged and open to receiving that sex education, really listening and really applying it to their life. And so another survey showed that 65% of students actually preferred mixed gender instruction. That's quite interesting. Alrighty, next one says that people with disabilities are only straight when they are sexual. Is that true or is that false? 1 for true or 2 for false? There's a couple 2s coming in the chat. I see 2s on the screen. Awesome. I love that. I also just saw the Chick-fil-A cups and that made my heart very happy because I have Taco Bell. That was what I wrote. That's what I chose this evening. Wonderful. Yeah, y'all absolutely got it right. So, of course, it's not true. People with disabilities are sexual and express their sexuality in many different ways, just as diverse as everyone else. And so that percentage of gay and lesbian orientation occurs at about the same rate for people with and without disabilities. So too often, a lot of people have power over an individual's expression of sexuality. And so for people with disabilities, when they may not have as much power or access to information about different sexual orientations or gender identities, it can be really harmful and hard for them to express who they really are. And so we also see that for transgender and gender diverse individuals, they are actually 3 to 6 times more likely to have autism. And so it's really important to just know that with or without disabilities, there's a wide range of sexuality and sexual orientation. All right, just a couple more. This one says that people are safer when they don't date. Is that 1 true or 2 false? See some 2s on the screen. See some 2s in the chat. Awesome. All right. Okay, y'all are correct again. Y'all know what you're talking about. So this is not true. Some, if not most of us, were raised in that era of stranger danger, kind of like we talked about at the beginning. I know I was told that a lot growing up, which, like we've mentioned, is not the most effective way to teach children safety precautions and probably shouldn't be used as the most, as the best practice for prevention efforts. So we know that most likely perpetrators of abuse are someone that person knows and trusts. And so the risk of abuse and assault for people with disabilities is, the risk of abuse and assault for people without disabilities is lower than the chance of people with disabilities. So for people without disabilities, this statement would be false. But people without disabilities would not be safer if they don't date. If you don't date someone, you still need to be aware of your safety in the community. And that's what's happening with safety in our community. So whether you're in a relationship and dating or not, there is always that idea that there might be some unsafe people out there, but we want to teach skills and we want to teach different healthy relationship tools so that we can best prepare ourselves and have a safe community around us. Okay. What we do know about safety and dating or not dating is that what does increase safety are meaningful relationships within that community. And so we want people to be out in the community forming these meaningful and healthy relationships, because that is a big protective factor of making sure that we have people in the community that we know and we trust and that we're building relationships with. We don't want to prevent someone from expressing their sexuality, because if they're if we try to force someone to not be sexual, then they might find other ways to express that sexuality, but we're not going to really know about it, and we're not going to be able to be there to support them through it, and they're more likely to be less safe. Okay. So thank you for playing along with that game. I know it's kind of a long game, but it's to get us thinking about kind of like what does our society say? What are things that maybe some people might believe to be true? Kind of debunking some of those myths. So we want you to have some talking points for when and if you come across these misconceptions in the community. And so now that we've debunked those with some research and facts, we're going to talk about what it means to build healthy relationship skills and what strengthening protective factors are. And so kind of the way that we're set up for this evening for this conversation is we're going to talk about what prevention looks like and different things that we can do to prevent abuse, to prevent violence, and then also what happens when it does happen and how we intervene. And so that's going to be prevention and intervention side. So we're going to get started with kind of prevention and what we can do. Okay. Self-determination is a big one. So self-determination, if you don't know, is the process by which a person controls their own life and a protective factor that we really want to encourage and strengthen for everyone. So greater self-determination increases that ability to recognize and resist abuse. From a 2005 study, it showed that when women with IDD participated in self-determination classes that focused on increasing refusal skills, they were better able to recognize and resist abuse. And so sex education is really crucial in self-determination as well, to make sure that we know what's going on with our bodies, and we can, we can have an idea of what's happening with our bodies, what's happening with our feelings, and how we best are processing all of that and getting to control that part of your life as well. That increases that self-determination. So skill building and community participation and meaningful relationships in the community is a way that we can also help people be safer in their relationships and in the community. And we have James Metters here on the screen, who, if you don't know, is a self-advocate and activist who speaks up for survivors of IDD. And James shares his experience of sexual assault and how he was able to get help and support from his coworkers because he had meaningful relationships with his coworkers. And that is a big demonstration of really what the importance of meaningful relationships in the community as the greatest protective factor for all people. So it demonstrates kind of why it's really important for us to not just kind of like close off to dating or relationships in the community, but to be able to build safe relationships out in the community, whether that's with coworkers, with friends, with people, with romantic partners and family. So it's really important that we build up self-determination and we build up community as well. Those are big protective factors against violence that's happening. So another tool that we want to talk through is self-advocacy and speaking up and saying what you need. And that can look like a lot of different ways. It doesn't always have to be verbally, but the foundation of self-advocacy is giving consent, whether that's saying yes or refusing and saying no. And there's a lot of different ways that we do that, whether that's vocally. We've talked a little bit about body language. We talked about facial expressions. There are a lot of different ways that people can say no. And so saying yes and no are skills that all people need to learn and practice. I know for me, I still am learning how to tell people no sometimes in my life. And so it can be really difficult for everyone to say no. And sometimes we might not feel like our no will be heard, and we might feel the pressure to say yes, or we might just be shy. And unfortunately, we know that often children and adults with disabilities are taught to comply. We've kind of talked about that compliance training and why that's a really big increased risk to go along and to say yes to all authority figures. And that could include parents, teachers, coaches, support staff. And so like we've mentioned, we call that compliance training. And it's sometimes it's so severe that individuals don't feel like they're allowed to express what they're truly feeling. And so compliance training is the opposite of self-advocacy. And compliance training makes it really difficult and impossible for individuals to say no, to advocate for what they need, and to feel or even report abuse. And so we want to combat that compliance training by always providing care based on consent. And I know we've talked about that a little bit, but validating and respecting when people say no. And so kind of like we talked about before, if an individual does not use verbal communication, We need to establish how that person consents and refuses, and then respond accordingly, and support them in building those skills, and kind of working on what that looks like for them, because it can be different for everyone. So these skills are really crucial for counteracting that compliance training, preventing abuse, and building healthy relationships. And so a couple other things that we want to talk about that help kind of like build up healthy relationships and kind of give us those strengthening protective factors. You'll see on the screen, you see like a healthy relationship toolbox. It's this big bright red toolbox. It's got 4 tools in it. And so along with self-advocacy, self-determination, and community support networks, this is a tool that we use in a curriculum that is being developed. It is almost completely done, which is exciting, and it's free to everyone. This is a big part of the curriculum, and it's called our Healthy Relationship Toolbox. And so in it, you'll see some tools that are there to help or guide us through thinking about relationships. And we're going to take a closer look into what each of these tools are and how we can use them in the lives of, in the different types of relationships in our lives. So there's a couple things on here. You'll see the I statements tool that says I want, I need, I feel. That helps us establish our boundaries. It helps us be able to tell people what we want, what we need, and what we feel. A lot of the times, it's sometimes in our classes for what we've had with this curriculum, and why I kind of bring it out is we've put I statements on like communication boards, and that's a helpful way to use I statements. We've also been able to use that with like communication cards, verbally, etc. The second tool is a no tool. We'll kind of go through that here in just a second as well. And then you'll see a little target on there that has a red circle, a yellow circle, and a green circle. That's called our relationship map. And then lastly is our consent check-in tool. So we're going to go through a couple of those now. So this is the relationship map. And so you'll see that the red circle has where strangers or people you only know online, people that you don't trust, people that you've never met in person, that's where those people live. You'll see in the yellow circle, those are people that you know well, you've known for a while, you have met them in person, and you're beginning to kind of build that trust and build that relationship. And then in our green circle right in the middle are adults that we love and trust. And so this is a tool based on the Circles curriculum that you can fill out with your child, with your young adult, with anyone, honestly. And it helps us think through relationships in different places, whether that's at home or at work or at school, at camp, etc. So we refer to this really constantly, and it's a great way to kind of see how well do I know this person, and can I trust them, and you know, where do they kind of fall in this relationship map. And so we do a lot of examples of like, how does someone move on the relationship map? How long does it take to get into that green circle of trust, and where should someone be on our map before we maybe think about being sexual with them, right? Or maybe before we flirt, maybe before we ask them out on a date. Like where are people when we're thinking through these relationships, right? Maybe our friend asks us for our passwords to social media. It's like, well, let me think of where they're at on my map, right? Like, first of all, why is that a boundary crossing? And can I trust these people? And so it's one of those, it's a tool that we use frequently in a lot of classes and a lot of teaching. And so, okay. Sorry, y'all, my computer kind of froze. There we go. Awesome. All right, so another tool that we talk about is our consent check-in tool. And so you saw before in the relationship map, or in the relationship toolbox, it's kind of it says ask first, and then it says respect the answer. And that is kind of the simplest way that we break down consent, is that we ask first and then we respect the person's answer, whether that's a yes or a no. And so consent means asking for someone for their permission to do something. And it's a part of a healthy relationship. And the person always has to ask the other person for consent. And if the other person says no and asking for their permission, they have to respect that answer and show that they respect that person's boundaries and limits to keep that healthy relationship. So part of our consent is that there are 4 main parts. So the first 2 parts of consent are thinking clearly and an excited yes. So when consent is being asked and both people need to be thinking clearly, that means that they are sober, they are not drinking alcohol, they are not doing drugs, and that they are awake. So they're not sleeping or kind of like passed out. And so really important that with consent, people are thinking clearly. The second part is an excited yes. And so an excited yes means that that person is freely and willingly giving an excited yes. So if I am sitting there and I'm like, yes, absolutely, I am so down for that. That is an excited yes. Whereas if I am saying, yeah, I guess so, and I maybe my head's down and I'm not feeling that, that's not an excited yes. And this is something that we talk about not only through our curriculum, but through a lot of our trainings, because when we think about consent, sometimes we think we know what it means, but there are these specific parts to consent that it's really important to kind of think about. And so it's important to note that just because a person gave an excited yes today doesn't mean that they always have to give a yes to that person or to any person. And that's another part of consent. So you can say yes one time and no another time, and that's totally okay. And that's what we want to teach like our young adults and our children, and really everyone. That's something that we want to know for everyone. And so always and every time you have a choice. People in relationships for a long time usually come up with ways to say yes or no more formally or less formally. So for example, one person might like raise an eyebrow and look questioning after their partner. Or maybe an intimate friend or a spouse, or maybe they might give like a no head shake, and it might be like an enthusiastic nod. So it looks a little different once you kind of develop relationships, but it's really important just at the basis of consent that it's an excited yes or no. And it's an excited yes. And so the last two parts of consent are that there is no pressure and that there's ongoing check-ins. And so no pressure means that that person or the people that are not telling you that you have to or that you need to make this decision. They're not making you or forcing you to do something that you don't want to do. And it means that they're not using any type of pressure like, oh, if you're my friend, you'll give me a hug, or oh, if you love me, you'll have sex with me. So there can't be any pressure when it comes to giving consent. And lastly, are ongoing check-ins. And that means that both people are frequently asking each other if they are still feeling good with what they gave consent to, and giving permission to do. And so ongoing check-ins are frequent, always asking and always checking in with that partner, making sure that people are feeling good in all processes of consent, whether that is with romantic partners or even friendships, right? One day I might want to go up and give my friend a hug, and that's totally fine and dandy, but maybe the next day they don't want a hug. And it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that we've got to continually kind of check in with people on consent. And so with these 4 parts of consent, it's really important that we put all these things together. And this is creating that culture of consent. With everything we do. So it can be something as simple as giving a high five or giving a hug, but all the way down to kind of like what our boundaries are, and whether that is in dating relationships or with professionals that are in our life. It's really important that through our boundaries and through like consent, we're building a culture where it starts at asking and respecting the answer. And so putting it all together, those are all 4 parts. And we should be teaching consent in both directions, right? People need to ask you for consent, and you also need to ask consent from them. And so we don't want to reinforce actions without consent. So for example, people, maybe kids giving a stranger a hug right now might be cute, maybe not. But maybe as they grow into being an adult and repeat that reinforced behavior, that can become a problem and increase that risk for violence. And so another, outside of just consent, we talked a little bit about consent and boundaries, and they kind of go hand in hand, and they're really big parts of developing healthy relationships in all types of relationships. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the no tool, which is something that we use and something that we can use in our society to kind of in our homes in order to build strengthening protective factors. And so the no tool is something we talk about regarding boundaries. And so there's a lot of different ways of like how we say no. We've talked about verbally, we've talked about with our body language, we've talked about facial expressions. There's a lot of different ways that people can say no. And the no tool is used to say no to anyone or anything at any time. And it's used to set boundaries. And it can also be used in conjunction with that I statement. So you'll see kind of on the screen to the right of the big no sign, there's this boundaries guide. And what we talk about a lot, and kind of something to reinforce, we like to have like concrete steps of how how can we look at boundaries, right? Like, what are the 3 things we need to follow? And the first thing is that we trust our feelings. And these are things that, these are tools that we use in order to increase healthy relationships, which then decreases the risk for violence. So trusting our feelings and trusting our gut of, if something makes you feel mad or scared or maybe grossed out or hurt, it's really important to listen to those. We talk about saying your boundary, whether that's using your voice, your signs, or your body. You can say no, or you can use an I statement. And then the third part of boundaries is getting safe. And so if your boundaries are being crossed, you can leave the situation, talk to somebody you trust, or call SAFE, or call a center that's going to be able to help you, or maybe potentially if it's an emergency, to call 911. And so these are kind of a couple of things that we teach and we talk through. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of an example of things that we have found to work really well in teaching boundaries, we're going to kind of play a little bit of a game that we do from the curriculum. And so can anyone tell me like what a boundary is first, before we kind of like jump in, and what a definition of a boundary might be? Yeah. If you're thinking of one, or if you're typing in the chat, I'm gonna keep looking, but if not, we'll move on. But boundaries tell you what you are okay with and what you're not okay with. Really simply put, boundaries are like, I'm cool with this and I'm not cool with this. And so in the curriculum, we play this game called Cool or Not Cool. And I just want us to go through a couple of examples straight from the curriculum. And I'm gonna read a statement, and you can type cool or not cool in the chat, or you can hold a thumbs up for cool or put a thumbs down for not cool, or unmute and say your answer if you feel like participating that way. So we'll go quickly through these. All right, let's see here. Okay, so this first one says, your romantic partner says you shouldn't eat cake because you will get fat. Is that cool or not cool? See, Jenna's got a thumb down. See a couple thumbs down. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see a couple thumbs down here on the screens. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you're right. The statement's not cool because it is a red flag if your partner is telling you what to eat, or what to wear, or who you can be friends with, or who you can contact or talk to, or where you can go. So if your partner is telling you that you can't eat cake because you get fat, that's a red flag. And in general, if you feel like your partner is controlling everything that you do, that is a red flag as well. When we talk about parts of a healthy relationship, one of the parts of a healthy relationship is that there is equality there. And so that means that not one person is the boss, and not one person is always saying what to do or always telling the other person what to do, right? We talk really a lot with students and a lot with with our high school group, right? Not one person is the boss. And that's really important in a healthy relationship. All right, this next one says that your job coach yells at you because you made a mistake at work. Is that cool or not cool? Yeah, see a couple thumbs down. See a couple not cool in the chat. Yeah, absolutely, you're correct. Statement is not cool. It is never okay for someone to yell at you, and nobody likes being yelled at. And so someone yelling at you is disrespectful, and they're not respecting you or your feelings. And we talk a lot about how it's really important to listen to our feelings, especially in any type of relationship, whether that's a professional relationship or a friendship. And so these are just skills that we're kind of like working on, and just different scenarios that we can talk about with our students or our kids of like, hey, would this be cool with you? Would this not be cool with you? And to kind of explore, what we think, and maybe like debunk some of those, because some people will be like, yeah, that's, it happens all the time. And then that's when we can kind of dive into some of those deeper conversations of like, well, why is this happening? So this next one, we're going to go through these pretty quick because I know we're already an hour in. And so this next one says, you're having a bad day and your classmate asks if they can give you a hug. Is that cool or not cool? Yeah, I see thumbs up. Y'all are right. Statement is cool. Your classmate asked for consent if they could hug you. And it is nice that they are caring about you and how you feel, and that they would like to give you a hug to try to help you feel better. And so it's cool that they definitely asked you. It is also cool if you're like, no, I don't want that hug today, but I appreciate you asking, right? Or, oh, no, I don't want a hug, but maybe I want a high five, right? And so giving options and allowing us to have control over that space and those boundaries is really important. All righty. Next one says, your friend slaps your butt, and when you get upset, they say it was just a joke. Is that cool or not cool? Yeah, I've got some immediate thumbs down. Absolutely not cool. Statement's not cool. It's not okay for someone to touch you without your consent, right? And this is a good example of kind of like starting that conversation. It's not cool. And the joke that the friend did was also not cool, and slapping hurts. It's not a good thing, and especially when you're touching somebody's body and accessing that without asking them. Another reason why this isn't cool is because in a healthy relationship, whether that's a friendship or a family member or a romantic partner, it's really important that that person respects you, right? A big part of a healthy relationship is respecting each other. That means our feelings, that means what's important to us, that means our bodies and our stuff as well. And so that's a big part of why we talk about respect in relationships. So the most important thing to note about building boundaries, now that we've kind of like gone through just a couple of examples of, the way that we kind of play games with students or with really with anyone, to kind of like talk through some of these ideas of what are healthy relationships, what am I okay with, what am I not okay with. We play a game called Cool or Not Cool, and what you can do as well is, if that seems like a good fit for you, is come up with those own situations or those own scenarios that might be happening in the community that you have, right? It might be about swim team, or it might be about a different job coach, or it might be something different, but having kind of those examples and talking through what we're cool with and what we're not cool with is really something that can really strengthen having a good community of relationships. So most important thing to note, building boundaries really don't happen overnight. It's not something that happens very quickly. Change takes repetition and time, right? I'm sure we've all heard that idea about how it takes like 18 to 21 days or something to break a habit. But on average, it really takes people a little over 2 months to get in their new habit to stick. And so consistency is the key to like this successful change, because we've talked about building that environment of boundaries and consent, and you can start really small, from when we're real little all the way up until we're adults. I know I'm still learning a lot about consent and boundaries for my life. And so it's something where it takes a lot of repetition and skill, or it takes a lot of repetition to build that skill, and to get that consistency is really key. So we want to be creating an intentional environment to build these skills. And the goal is to do that by daily modeling from like authority figures, right? So to make examples of building consent and of building boundaries. And so not necessarily saying like, don't go and hug your kiddos, but we invite you to like kind of like change that language and the steps around hugging your kid, right? Like, hey, can I give you a hug right now? If they're like, absolutely not, you're like, okay, cool. I hear would a high five be okay? Like, and if it's still a no, that's okay too. We just want to kind of create a really intentional environment around building these skills. And it can be hard too, because I've even noticed, if I'm interacting with my nephews, I can notice myself being like, oh, just come here and hug me or whatever. And I have to remember, like, am I creating that space for them to make a decision in how we're interacting as well? And that can be really important. And it's a skill that goes really long term as far as like how we let other people treat us. And so trying to build a really intentional environment is important. But prevention work is everyone's job. And so limited trainings, kind of like this one, have limited impact. And so it's important to know that you have a role to play in like building and modeling and respecting boundaries, right? Like one class kind of doesn't do it all for everyone. And I know repetition, like we've talked about, is really important. So having that daily modeling from people in your life that are authority figures can be really valuable to developing those skills. Okay, got one more, and then we're going to take like just like a quick second to breathe, because I know we're throwing a lot of information out there. So now that we've talked about some of those tools that we have in the toolbox and how to help make our relationships like stronger and safer, and a couple different ways that we can start building really core skills in order to be safer in our relationships and in our life, we want to talk about some ways that can help us talk about these topics with our friends and family and with our kids or students. So just a couple of tips of talking about dating and sex and kind of what helps talk through some of these awkward topics, right? Is it's really important to acknowledge the unscientific terminology that is out there, but it's also really important and good to share the scientifically correct words as well. So that includes, whether that is on a communication board, or being able to kind of like say like, hey, I know we call penises this, and I know we call them, there might be a slang term that they've heard used, right? And you can give really good examples of like, this is unscientific, this is what this is, and I mean the same thing, right? So that we know that we can have those words to talk about our body parts. And so another really good, it's really good to avoid negativity. To not make dating and sex sound like scary, but to stay positive when talking about dating and sex. It's important to avoid scare tactics and shame and judgment, because we want children and students to keep talking to us like about sex, right? To ask those questions and to be able to receive an answer so that they can be as safe as they possibly can when moving through relationships, right? And knowing what those things are and having those ways that they can communicate. And so, like we've mentioned before, talking about the topics can be really weird, can be really difficult, but it's important to always use accurate pictures and really plain language. So examples would be using the term penis and saying things like sperm or vulva, sex, and showing pictures of what those things look like, right? So showing what sperm looks like and the anatomically correct body parts when we're kind of giving this information. So people learn in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different ways that we learn. So having pictures for people who learn best by seeing could be important, and having plain language for people who learn best by listening is really important. And then maybe activities for those who are kinesthetic learners. So when we're talking about dating and sex and giving short answers, to not make it hard or confusing, and to understand, to be completely honest and say the truth, so that there's like no misinformation. We want to be really clear. And we want to be really honest, so that way we can give accurate answers. But if we don't know the answer, it's really important for us to say so. If we don't know what the answer to a question is, maybe we say, I'm not sure, let me get back to you on that. And that's something that is really important. Or maybe you could look it up together and start learning that information together. So that's always really important to you, is to keep that line of communication open, so that when you are looking up answers or you're wanting to answer questions, that's a really important way to do so. Okay. Another thing that we want to talk about is that all types of identities should be included when we're talking about bodies and relationships and sex. And so we want to maybe try reframing the language that we're using to be gender neutral, and using examples of inclusion visually. That could look like pride flags. It could look like other positive signs. But another tip is that when you're talking about relationships, you could use inclusive language like boyfriend and boyfriend, or girlfriend and girlfriend, or romantic partner, just to include all type of romantic relationships, and including kind of resources that are also inclusive of LGBTQIA resources for everyone. Because like we kind of talked about a while back, we don't want to make assumptions of maybe sexual orientation or people that they might be having conversations about sex with, or about dating, or about friendships and things like that. So just important to keep it inclusive and also accessible. So the next part is talking about having pictures or visual or physical objects to learn. We talked through there's a lot of different ways that people learn, and so some people with disabilities learn better with pictures or visuals or physical objects, and that applies to people without disabilities as well. So some people learn better with repetition and being able to kind of like physically be able to have an example in front of them, or to be able to see kind of the graph constantly, or to hear the same information over and over again, so it's repeated. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back just a second. So everyone is most likely to learn when they are having fun, or playing games, or role playing, or using art, because of their brain like studying the information. And so content that is like culturally and currently linked together is more interesting and gets people engaged and gets people kind of talking about it more. And so there's a couple different interactive activities that we particularly have in the curriculum, but also other things that are just out there in our day-to-day lives. And so we want to get creative, because there are a lot of different ways that we can talk about our bodies and boundaries and sex and dating with our kiddos. And that can even be from the movies that we watch, and we can pause it and be like, whoa, did you see that? How did you feel about that? Like, what do you think about that? Right? Like, was that cool? Was that not cool? And there's a lot of different ways. We see it a lot in our daily life. There's a lot of examples out there. And so we can use, specific games or activities, kind of like some of the ones that we've done here, like talking about like, oh, is that true? Is that false? Is that cool? Or is that not cool? Tell me how you think about this. But we can also use those everyday games, activities, or moments like watching movies or TV shows to talk through different scenarios and topics, because they're around us constantly. So definitely encourage getting creative of kind of like how those conversations come up. Another thing that I just want to mention is the state curriculum that we're working on called My Rights, My Life. And that's what you've seen quite a few examples from throughout this. It's going to be available and free to all people, hopefully early this spring. We're so close to getting it done. And so it will be available to have some of those materials, whether that's examples or maybe just kind of ways to phrase a conversation, anything that might be helpful. So each class has a facilitator's guide and a PowerPoint and with instructions and notes. And so it will be available in English and Spanish as well. So that's going to be another just resource in case you do want to have more conversations about these kind of topics. There's 30 different classes and throughout 4 units. So yeah, and my coworker Heidi has a lot of information on that. So if you're looking for more, I can definitely connect you with Heidi or send questions over to Heidi that you might have about that curriculum. So, okay. Whew. We're gonna like take a breather because we've talked through a lot of different things. And it's just been me talking at you for a while. So thank you for sticking with me. So what I like to do, just kind of to reset before we kind of we've talked a lot about preventative, right? Like what are things that we can bring to make our relationships more healthy so that we can lower that increased risk for trauma and violence. That's a lot of skills that we've talked about building and ways that we can do that. Now we're going to kind of shift our attention to intervention and how do we intervene when violence is happening. And so before we do that, we're going to do just a quick breathing exercise that I love to do because it helps me slow down. It helps us all kind of like connect and get our brain back. But it's just the 5-finger breathing. And so what I'm going to do is as I kind of trace up my thumb, we're going to breathe in. And as I trace down, we're going to breathe out, and same throughout all the rest of the fingers as well. So you don't have to do this on screen if you don't want, but feel free to participate. So here we go. And I'll kind of say it as we go. So we're going to breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. And breathe in and breathe out. Last one, breathe in and breathe out. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for doing that. I appreciate it. It's always good. This is a lot of information. It's a lot of topics. It's a lot of hard stuff, honestly. And it's a lot of kind of, might be new information. It might not be new information, but I want to make sure that we kind of like, now we're shifting gears. So I want us to kind of all shift together, and that can be hard if we're just kind of tumbling through. So, all right, here we go. So you'll see on the slide, it says indicators of sexual assault, abuse, or exploitation. And so while we've talked through like why we're here, right? We've talked through violence in the lives of people with disabilities. We've talked about many things, misconceptions, ways that we can build protective factors. It's really imperative that we understand how to prevent this. And then if it can't be prevented, to understand how to intervene in an effective way. Because this is happening in our community, right? We've talked about those statistics and that it is definitely happening. And so odds are throughout our lifetime, we might work with someone who's experiencing this, or have a relationship with somebody who's experiencing this, or know someone. And so we want to be ready to support, and how, we want to know how we might respond to someone when they come forward. We want to know, what do the indicators look like for youth and adults who have experienced sexual assault, abuse, or exploitation. So we're going to talk about the indicators because it's important to know what to look for, not only when suspecting abuse, but as members of the wraparound community for people with disabilities, to keep an eye out for, since like we learned about at the beginning of the presentation, they are significantly at a higher risk for these types of violence against them. So We're going to talk through what indirect disclosures kind of look like first. So what are some of the behavioral indicators that y'all have seen when maybe a student or a child or a teenager or maybe a young adult has had something like traumatic happen to them? Are there any indicators that y'all have seen behaviorally, or you can put them in the chat or you can unmute if you want. Anger. Yeah, anger can be expressed in a lot of different ways as well, right? It can be on our face. It can kind of be in like our body language. It can be through like outbursts of emotion. It can be through signs and how our body's reacting. Aggression, yeah. Keep thinking of some of those, and if they come up in the chat, I'm going to try to read them as we keep going. Okay, so yeah, so what we want to look at is we want to pay attention to the signs and indicators of abuse. And so signs of physical abuse, yeah, being withdrawn and isolated, absolutely, absolutely. There are some physical signs and some physical ailments that might come with indicators of abuse, and there's also behavioral indicators, right? And so we're going to kind of go through a couple of different types of indicators, and I'm going to keep looking at the chat. Becoming abusive with themselves, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Self-harm in any way, absolutely. So some survivors may not have the language or may be too scared to disclose abuse. Nonverbal and indirect disclosures are really common and important to recognize, things to keep an eye out for. And you may also get information from like family members or caregivers who comment on like a changed behavior, maybe somebody who is also in their life really consistently or maybe has a really apparent role in their life. And so the important thing is that it's a change in behavior without any other explanation. And those are those indirect disclosures, right? It's a change in behavior without any other explanation. And so we are going to go through kind of some of these behavioral indicators. You can see some here, some that we've talked about, but there's a lot of different examples. We've got increased fear or distrust, change in mood or appetite, loss of skills previously gained, stomach aches, pain, complaints, denial, angry outbursts. We've talked about a couple of those. Specifically, a couple other behavioral indicators. The sudden change in appetite, it can look like an increase or a decrease. It can look like compulsive eating or dieting. Fear and withdrawal or avoidance of certain people, places, activities, or situations, and especially of maybe things that they used to really be all about and really want to be around those people, and maybe now they're more withdrawn, or maybe it's a certain place or activity, right? Activity meaning it could be like school, it could be classes, or it could be, maybe their extracurricular that they want to be a part of, or maybe something that they used to like to do, like maybe they like to read books and now they don't. It's something that is a change in behavior without an explanation. So sudden, significant, or unusual change in demeanor, mood, or behavior, that can be more fearful, that can be rage, that can be insecurity, withdrawn, distracted, or distant at odd times. A lot of those really extreme feelings and changes in demeanor and mood and behavior. We also talked a little bit just about increased drug or alcohol use or other self-destructive behaviors, like somebody had mentioned, such as self-harming behaviors. That could be cutting or burning, or like we've talked about with food, more not eating, etc. And so a couple other things to mention that we want to talk about with behavioral indicators, and some of these resonate more strongly with youth than they do with adults, but suddenly having maybe more money or toys or other gifts without reason, suddenly maybe writing or drawing or playing, writing and drawing and playing or dreaming of sexual or frightening images. For youth specifically, maybe exhibiting new adult-like sexual behaviors, language, or knowledge. But it is also important for our youth and for our kind of like school age kiddos that it's important to note when that language is coming up, like, are they a part of sex education? That could be really helpful and beneficial that they're using that language. But if it's not coming from like a comprehensive sex education, and that there's no reason why those terminologies should be kind of being introduced, then that is where we want to be concerned from. But if it's coming from comprehensive sex education, that's a good thing. If it's coming kind of out of left field with no explanation of where they're getting these terminologies, that's when it's a problem. And so nightmares or other sleep problems without explanation. And there's also, we're talking about maybe suddenly falling of grades or withdrawing from activities and classes that they previously enjoyed. So those are some of our behavioral indicators. Next, we want to kind of talk through emotional and mental indicators. And so signs of depression or anxiety. With depression, it can be hopelessness, extreme sadness, reduced appetite, uncontrollable crying, things like that nature. And then anxiety can include, some of those signs of anxiety can be avoidance, worrying or trouble breathing, overactive thinking about health. It can be very, a lot of overactive thoughts. And so a couple other things might be suicidal thoughts or attempts, or thinking about oneself or body as like repulsive or dirty or bad, because after experiencing abuse, both youth and adults can view their body as being repulsive, dirty or bad. And trauma can change the way we view ourselves based on the blame and the guilt and the shame and the loss of sense of self that can follow from those experiences. So another example could be leaving clues that are likely to provoke a discussion about sexual issues, right? Maybe that could be mentioning topics related to sex or aggression and body parts, or asking questions for a friend, or pushing boundaries, things that are abnormal to their daily interactions and experiences. And it might be, that might include a lot of the behavioral indicators that we talked about, whether that's like self-harming or being aggressive and showing that aggression. And then some other signs that are specific to youth and children could be the refusal to talk about a secret shared with an older adult or another child, specifically like an older child. And then also another sign to kind of like think through that might be talking about like a new older friend, right? Talking about like kind of like a new person that has entered into their life. And so it's just really important to kind of like be aware of those people and those relationships and kind of those conversations that are happening about people in their lives. Physical indicators are things that we can see or feel or that are happening to our physical body. And so these things can include, but are not limited to, these things that you can see on the screen. So we've got torn, stained, or bloody underclothing and sheets, unexplained pain or bleeding or discharge or injury to genitals, anus, or mouth. We've got unexplained vaginal infections or sexually transmitted infection diseases or pregnancy, and pain during urination or bowel movements. A couple other physical indicators to note that aren't on the screen are wetting or soiling, unrelated to disability or toilet training. So anything that might be out of the norm with toileting. And then also difficulty swallowing, unrelated to disability as well. That might be, as long as it's unrelated to maybe something that they might already be dealing with. And so bruising to the breast or genital area is also important to note and to be aware of. And then new vocabulary for body parts or sexual activity is also something that we kind of want to think about when we're thinking about kind of how that might be a behavioral one, but it also refers to our physical body. So we want to mention it for physical indicators as well as where's that language coming from? Why have we kind of heard that? And knowing kind of like where that is stemming from. And so those are all of our indicators that we kind of just like have bullet points on, things that we want to keep thinking about as we're talking about what things to look for. And so when we've suspected that somebody is experiencing abuse, or we've got, we've suspected or people are disclosing to us, now we want to kind of talk through how we respond, right? What supports do we give, and how can we be a trauma-informed responder? And so we've gone through quite a few subjects, including the indicators. And so let's talk about trauma-informed responding. We just want to be able to respond and encourage healing without re-traumatizing survivors. And so That's why we want to talk about kind of the way that we're going to respond. So number one is to always believe the person. That is number one in trauma-informed responding. Believe their story and listen to them. And so start by believing. You can say it. You can say, I believe you. You'll see on these screens or on these slides through trauma-informed responses, anything that is in red and in quotations are things that you can say and things that we encourage in a trauma-informed like response to a disclosure of abuse. And so you want to remind that person that they are safe with you right there, right now, that you can say things like, I am glad that you're sharing this with me and I am here for you. An appropriate response could be, I'm sorry that that happened to you. But we definitely want to make sure that we're not making promises that we can't keep, right? Like this will never happen again, or I'm always going to keep you safe. It's one of those things where we don't want to make promises that we can't keep. So reminding them that they're safe with you right there, right now, letting them know that you believe them, that it is not their fault. It's really important that trauma-informed responding includes telling them that the abuse was not their fault, and understanding that there could be a variety of emotions after abuse, and all of which are normal. So whether that's feeling really numb, whether that's laughing about the experience, or being really angry, or being super sad, like there is a lot of emotions that can come from violence. And so it's important to note that all of those are normal. They're all completely normal, and it is not their fault. They have many strengths and the bravery to tell. They have survived this form of violence. And so it's really important to note that the survivor is not alone and that they can get help. So just by believing someone, you can change their entire trajectory of how they will go or not go to people for help in the future, right? So by you being a person that they have trusted to tell this to, or to talk through, or that you've noticed, that this is happening, it's really important to believe the person, because that can really change how they go forward in their life with getting help from someone in the future. And that's why we talk about kind of what trauma-informed responding is. It's got a really big impact. And so I want to mention also that like at the time of the abuse or the assault, that person was a victim being victimized. But if they survived, they are no longer a victim. They are survivors, and there is healing. People can most definitely move on to not only become a survivor, but a person who is growing and is thriving. And so the statements are some things that you can say when you are listening and validating those emotions, because like we talked about, there can be a lot of them. We want to listen with care and without any judgment, and acknowledge their feelings. So I can tell you are scared. It sounds like this is really hard for you, or you've gone through so much. And like the last slide mentioned, there are a variety of emotions, which are all very normal. One of which might be that they still have love for their abuser. So we want to avoid speaking negatively about the person who is the perpetrator of violence. You can definitely talk about that person's behaviors and how that is not okay, but not them as a person. And we'll kind of get into a little bit more of that here in just a second. Another really important part of trauma-informed responding is affirming their strengths. And so trauma can make us feel a lot of really negative emotions, and often about ourselves. And so affirming strengths and helping that person identify their strengths and their power and their control over how they move forward is really key. So we want to offer those specific reminders of the person's positive qualities and actions. So you see a couple examples on the screen of, you're really strong for handling this all by yourself. You are courageous for telling me. You are speaking out to protect yourself and others. That can be really a wonderful thing to affirm those strengths and give that person back that identity of positive qualities. Another thing that we want to think about when we're doing trauma-informed responses is empowering and respecting our survivor and our person who has experienced violence. And so you'll see a couple other examples on there, as you can tell me as much or as little as you'd like. What can I do to support you, and what would you like to do next? Those are all really great responses when we're talking about disclosures. Giving that power back, like we just mentioned, is really important, but also respecting what they want to do moving forward. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second as well. Okay. Next is supporting that person. When we have listened and validated, respected, empowered, and supported them, with support, it can look like, it can be the question of, what can I do to support you? What do you need from me right now? Do you need me to listen? Do you need me to call for help? Do you need me to make a report? Like, there's a lot that goes into supporting, and supporting also looks like planning for future safety. It can look like safety planning. And so once we've listened and validated, respected, empowered, and supported, we want to let survivors set their own pace for healing. And that can look like, what are you most worried about right now? It can look like the question, what do you need right now? And then also, what would you like to do next? Giving them the chance to make a choice about where they go with their disclosure. It is important to remember that when you are viewed as an authority figure, and in that relationship of disclosing, it's really important to remember what that means when you're responding to a disclosure or going through a healing journey with a survivor. So power and control dynamics will be really important to recognize. You want to remember that they are disclosing abuse to you, and whether that's happened recently or years prior, it's really immensely important to recognize the role that consent plays in trauma-informed responses. So making sure to ask consent before reacting with a hug or holding a hand or rubbing a back or a shoulder, remembering to give a survivor a choice as to how you interact with them physically throughout that disclosure is really important as well, because it can kind of be maybe second nature if you grew up with people just like constantly hugging without asking, or grabbing somebody's hand, or if it's your initial natural reaction to touch people to make them feel comfortable. It might be more of it's just something that we want to be aware of when we're talking about disclosures and finding out about abuse. And so another thing that we want to talk through is, like we said before, not making promises that we can't keep, like this will never happen again. Oh, so sorry. Sometimes I scroll and it just goes a lot faster. But another thing is to be honest and keep your word. And so one of the ways that might look like is, if you tell me that you or another student or another person is being abused, like I will need to let somebody know. And we're going to talk about mandatory reporting in just a second. But it's really important to be honest about kind of what you might need to do if there is a disclosure, depending on that relationship with that person who is disclosing, whether that's a child or a young adult or somebody else in the community. So it's really important to remember to take care of yourself too, throughout a disclosure response and process, and like the journey of healing. These conversations and disclosures can come as a shock, and they can even bring on guilt to those who are listening, with maybe thinking like, I didn't do enough for them to stop this, or maybe I could have done something, or I could have done more. And it's really, really important to take care of yourself. We're going to dive into that again and kind of repeat a little bit of that in just a second. But really important to know that you are important in that situation as well, to take care of them, where there's a lot of steps to remember about like what it is to be to give like a trauma-informed response. It also is important to take care of yourself. So a couple things that we want to avoid when we are responding to disclosures, or we're finding out about abuse or violence, is try to avoid those why questions, because even with the best intentions of why, they can sound maybe accusatory or create blame. And so this is definitely an opposite of why I believe you. So I believe you and why are very opposite ways to kind of respond. And so we want to avoid the why, we want to believe the survivor. And so we also don't want to minimize what is happening or what those feelings are. So we want to control our own emotions and remain calm and non-judgmental and caring. And we want to make sure that we're not minimizing their situation. So lastly, a couple things that we want to avoid is speaking negatively about the person who hurt them. I know I touched on that just a second ago, but it's really important to know, especially from the statistics that we talked about all the way back at the beginning, was that 97 to 99% of people who are abused know and trust and their perpetrator, right? Their abuser. And so this person may still love that person and only want the abuse to stop. And so it's really important to not speak negatively about that person who hurt them. You can absolutely talk about those behaviors and that it was not okay, and that it was not the survivor's fault. It's not anybody's fault but their own, and so but the perpetrator's own fault for perpetrating that violence. But it is yeah, we want to avoid those negative things about that person who hurt them. And then lastly, trying to avoid self-disclosures. So sharing your own personal experiences or shifting that attention away from the person who is disclosing to something else or someone else is what we want to avoid, because it takes away from them having the power to disclose and tell and make their steps forward from where they want to go from that and what they want to happen. So like we also talked about, we want to talk about kind of like responding to ourselves, whether that's caretakers or being parents or being in the daily life of a person with a disability. I want to acknowledge that hearing that your child has been abused or hurt can be really, really hard. It is really, really hard. And it will most likely be really tough to manage emotions in front of that child or young adult. But remember, what you say to your child in the moment can really affect them. A lot of responses might be, or an initial response might be, I'm going to get who hurt you. They're never going to do this again. And that can really scare that child or that person and make them worry about you, which then shifts that conversation, that discussion to something else and someone else other than them and what they're disclosing. And that's what we want to try to avoid. And so that child or young adult may feel like really guilty and strong reactions and cause like a multitude of other emotions while also disclosing. And we want to do our best to not re-traumatize or create more trauma for them. And so remembering that it is not your fault. As the caretaker or the parent, it is not your fault. Just like it is not the survivor's fault, it is not your fault. It is only the perpetrator at fault for the harm that they caused. And so you can help them heal. And that's the beauty of that relationship, is that you can help them heal. It was not your fault that they were hurt. This idea and practice of trauma-informed responding is a way to like shift understanding of how we protect our youth. And so like the slide before this mentioned, you have to take care of yourself too while you respond in a trauma-informed way. And that can be a lot to take on, but having these conversations and kind of just knowing a couple things that you can say and do, and then also recognizing it's not your fault. You know, we're not all perfect and we might not all respond perfectly when these situations happen, but kind of keeping these things in the back of our mind and giving ourselves reminders of how to be a trauma-informed responder is really important in the long run for how we communicate and disclose abuse throughout our community. And so a couple other benefits of disclosures. Oh, let me actually go back because I don't think I was done with that. Yeah, I'll move on. Never mind, it's right here. So a couple other benefits of disclosures is that you're building that trusting relationship. And, you know, we've talked a lot about what it looks like to build skills, what it looks like, different ways that we can build up protective factors and healthy relationships, talking about creating a culture of consent and really practicing boundaries. And that can look really different for everyone. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. But when we're talking about disclosures and we're talking about, you know, taking care of yourself, if you are the one that's listening to disclosure, it's really important to note too that this person is disclosing to you, whether it is a child or a young adult or another person in the community, that they are trusting you with something that is huge and that has really affected them. And so building a trusting relationship, and like we've talked about with responding to disclosures, it's really important for the person to realize that they're not alone and that there are adults that do care about them and that are not going to hurt them. And so these are just a couple other benefits of disclosures. And benefits is a kind of, can be a difficult word to like read when we're talking about disclosures because it doesn't seem like there would be any benefits there, but it is really important to note that that person is not alone. They can heal and they can get help. And it is not their fault for what happened. So it's important that during disclosures, we are recognizing their voice, their story, and their experience because it matters. And that's that's one of the benefits of having disclosures, is that building that trusting relationship and helping people recognize their own advocacy skills as well. So Couple other things that I just want to kind of wrap up about with trauma-informed responding. We want to talk about establishing clear boundaries, and this is going to look different for different relationships for people that are in the daily lives of people with disabilities, right? So if you're a parent, it might look different than if you're a teacher, than if you are a service provider, than if you are an advocacy group, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like we've talked about before, it is really important to validate that decision to disclose. Like, I'm so glad that you feel comfortable enough to talk with me about this. But it is also really important to clarify what you cannot keep a secret. And so looking at what a mandatory reporter is and reporting looks like in your state or in your county, or specifically where you're located, is really important. Here in Texas, everyone is a mandatory reporter. And so we talk about often that if somebody is to disclose, giving people an option, right? If they're going to tell you what's happening, letting them know that, hey, I am a mandatory reporter and I am here for you. You can share anything with me if you like, but I just want to be really clear that if you tell me that you or someone else is in immediate danger, I will need to either contact a crisis line, or I will need to let someone else know. I'll need to make a report to APS or CPS, depending on, the situation that's happening. So it's really important to talk about what our role is while someone is disclosing, because that's also recognizing kind of like our power and control, and kind of us as like authority figures. So another thing, just to establish clear boundaries, is that you can also offer to connect that person that is disclosing to other professionals, if it's not, if it is kind of more of a professional relationship versus maybe parent and child. And so just a couple other things. Lastly, we just want to talk about, if there is immediate danger in one of these situations, you want to call a local crisis number or 911. I know we have information on here about Texas, but it might look different for where you are. But if you suspect any kind of child abuse here in Texas, you are required to report that within 48 hours. And so another thing about like kind of additional support is that if there's not immediate danger, we encourage you to either that is another option to getting help and to getting support that can be a part of that safety plan. And then lastly, if that situation includes stalking or digital abuse, like we definitely encourage to document by taking screenshots or recording each incident. That'll be really important in the reporting process as well. And so those are a couple of technical things kind of at the end of the emotional process of reporting and what that looks like. And if anyone ever has any questions about what reporting might look like where you are, because I know we're not all from Texas. And so if you do have questions, or if you're looking for more resources, please feel free to reach out to me. And I will do my best to get you the correct resources for where you're located, and maybe anything else that might additionally be helpful. Other than that, I want to kind of end our time. This is a quote by Brene Brown. It says, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. And it's one that we just like to share about, at the end, because it's hard to, sometimes it's hard to share. And when we're talking about disclosures, it's really important to know that when we're the ones responding with empathy and understanding, that shame can't survive there. And they're, And so here's a couple of resources. I'm happy to send these out kind of afterwards, or to Jenna if anyone is interested in kind of being able to go back and look at these. And then lastly, there's another thing that we could do, but we're running out of time, and I know everyone likes to end earlier rather than later. So does anyone have any questions kind of before I've got 2 little evaluation links, if you don't mind being a part of those. And then other than that, just looking at questions. So does anybody have anything? And if I can't answer them, or if I don't give a great answer, I'm going to confer with my colleagues and definitely get back with you as well. I'm going to post another link in the chat, which is just kind of this post-evaluation form. We started with those 4 questions kind of at the beginning from that link. And I just want to kind of revisit those and just see if you can and are willing to participate one more time for me. That would be lovely. Just to kind of see, maybe your thoughts changed on some of those questions, maybe they didn't, and that's totally okay too. Just a fun thing to kind of see where we're at the end of the session. And then lastly, I've got one other link, and if any link is important of this whole thing, it's this one. But we've got a training evaluation. This helps us understand what we can do better, what things that maybe you want to know more about. And so we would really appreciate this. This helps us with our funding as well to understand kind of where we can go with all of our stuff, all the stuff within the program. So we would really appreciate that. And I'm going to put that link in the chat as well once I can figure out my computer. And okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Actually, yeah, I'm going to stop sharing really quickly so I can put that in the chat. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I know you've listened to me talk for a long time, so thank you for sticking through it.
Thank you, Autumn. We appreciate you coming on. Sorry, my video is off. I'm feeding my baby.
Oh, you're totally fine.
But yeah, guys, we have about 12 minutes left with our time. So if you guys have any questions for Autumn, I'm going to leave the video going, the call going until 9 o'clock. So feel free to stay on and ask her questions and have a chat with her if you'd like. And then please do fill out that evaluation for her as well.
That would be awesome.
I am a little shocked. Did you message?